Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this is Ginger Snap. So welcome back to our living room for our Tuesday night Bible studies that go along with our worship series for the season, Full to the Brim, with some discussion questions that were written by a colleague of mine, the Reverend Ruth Farrell, who is a UCC pastor serving a church in Illinois. So you might recall that last week I suggested that you might have a kaleidoscope on hand. So I'm sure you all remembered that from last week and have one within hand's reach at this very moment in time. And anyway, so let's get into this week's story. So this week we have the story of the prodigal son. It's a bit of a Bible language pet peeve for me that the word prodigal is only ever used in the English language in connection to this parable, so much so that most people couldn't define it if asked. Because you say the word prodigal and your brain finishes with son. And anyway, pet Bible language peeve of mine. Anyway, so what do you know or remember about this story from times you've heard it in the past, or perhaps even times when you heard it 2 days ago this past Sunday? And where has life felt lacking in grace this week? So as I read the story now, I might invite you to read it alongside me, out loud even, because sometimes when we read things out loud, we kind of slow down and notice things we might not otherwise. So the scripture texts throughout Lent this year are stories about abundance. And finally, 4 weeks into Lent, we actually have a parable from Jesus that seems, even at first glance, to be about abundance and fullness and expansiveness, whereas the past several weeks we've needed to dig a little bit into the metaphors and language and parables in order to see the expansive grace that is in fact there. So, from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And please don't bite the ribbon in the Bible, Ginger Snap. That's very rude. All the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." And so the father divided the property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would have gladly filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father. And I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he sent off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound." Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But the son answered his father, "Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." This is the word of the Lord. So sit in silence for a moment and allow the words of this story to just seep in. So what thoughts came up as you read and sat in silence with this text? What questions do you have about the text? Is there anything that bothers you about this story? Are there any parts of the story that bring you hope? So the word prodigal has two primary definitions. One, spending money or resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant. And two, having or giving something on a lavish scale. We often see this parable through the lens of definition one, spending money or resources freely and recklessly and wastefully. How does seeing it through the lens of definition two, giving something on a lavish scale, change the parable's meaning for you? So the Reverend Ruth Farrell talks about the parables as kaleidoscopes. It would have been more dramatic if I'd clicked on the right thing at the right moment. Kaleidoscopes. If you have one, you might play with it for a few minutes now. This is an antique one that I borrowed from Carol this week. She says that it was given her by a former member of People's, and usually there's a bit that you twist, whereas with this one you rotate the whole canister. It's really cool. So kaleidoscopes have these series of mirrors that reflect off the patterns, kind of like if you were making a paper snowflake, if you cut it and then the cuts are in the same place all around the thing. Anyway, a series of mirrors. Anyway, it's a neat way of looking at things. Anyway, so parables, just like kaleidoscopes, are meant to be rotated around and around so we can see their ever-changing beauty. We're supposed to consider what it would be like to be the different characters in the story, be they people or places or things. we're intended to consider what the story sounded like, smelled like, felt like, etc. But sometimes, particularly with familiar parables, we get stuck thinking about the story in a limited way. For instance, in this week's story, most commonly called The Prodigal Son, we tend to either get stuck thinking of ourselves as the younger son or the older son. But we would be wise to keep rotating around the parable so we can see the ever-changing things Jesus has to share with us through it. So how do you connect with the younger son? Or how do you struggle to connect with the younger son? How do you connect with the Father? Or how do you struggle to connect with the Father? How do you connect with the older son? Or how do you struggle to connect with the older son? Pick another character in the story. How do you connect with them? Or how do you struggle to connect with that character? So who is missing from this story? Really think about that for a moment. There's someone obvious not mentioned. It's the mom of the two sons. What do you think happened to their mom or to the father's wife? Why do you think Jesus doesn't include her? Father Thomas Keating argues that the mother or wife isn't here because this allows the father to break the patriarchal norms of the day and act like a mother, looking longingly out the front door for her son, running to hug and kiss him, lavishing him with gifts, trying to cajole the oldest son into celebrating with her. How does it change the parable for you if you see it this way? Many pastors and theologians today have begun to suggest we stop calling this story the prodigal son, because that's not really the focus of the story. Instead, they suggest we retitle this story the prodigal parent, or the loving parent. How might retitling this story in your own mind help you think about it this way? This parable invites us to consider how God's grace is prodigal, extravagant, lavish, illogical. This parable disrupts and expands our definitions of grace. How could seeing God's grace as prodigal change your understanding of grace? Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber insists, your relationship to God is not determined by your virtue. It is not determined by being nice or being good. Your relationship to God is simply determined by the wastefully extravagant love of God. A God who takes no account of risk, but runs towards you, no matter what saying, all that is mine is yours. What's your gut reaction to this quote? A God who takes no account of risk, but runs toward you, no matter what, saying, "All that is mine is yours." So when and with whom do you struggle to give prodigal, extravagant, lavish, illogical grace? How might you offer prodigal grace in those situations in the week ahead? Where are you needing to experience prodigal, extravagant, lavish, illogical grace in the week ahead? Perhaps you might write a prayer asking God to help you see and experience prodigal grace. Where have you experienced extravagant, lavish, illogical life in the past week? So for this week's Bible study, I had suggested that you might have a kaleidoscope on hand. For next week, as we talk about Jesus' feet being perfumed with nard, you might grab the nard that you definitely have in your household at this moment, because everybody has nard in their household. I actually did buy some recently from the Holy Land, but it hasn't arrived yet, so there goes that. But if you don't happen to have nard lying around, perhaps you have some perfume or scented lotion or vanilla extract or cinnamon extract. Both of these are homemade that I did a couple years ago. I like vanilla extract better than perfume. Anyway, you might have something on hand that smells nice so that we can embody the story as we read it together. So until then, I'm going to wake you up here so we can say goodnight to our friends. Yeah, I know, it's ironic to wake you up to say goodnight. So until next time, peoples, good night.